9 months to understand, and I get it 100% now. Um, but just can I get, I know we're doing this on the radio too, but can I just get a show of hands of the last time you remember not using the internet one single day? Oh, there's a lot of people. I wonder if you were camping. So obviously it's one of those things that we use every single day. And I think there are several layers to the issues that we have here in Portland. We are really lucky in the fact that we are a city. So we're not in a rural area. We do have, we'll talk about this a little bit more, but we do have companies who actually do want to provide internet service to us, and we can talk about, the quality there. But, in terms of Oregon and the government or the country at large, like Portland's doing okay. We have access for the most part. I would say that, a lot of that is cable. We really want to work towards fiber and fiber to the home. I think that's one thing that Michael and I would probably agree with. I think that's generally the best way to go about the infrastructure piece. On top of that, though, we are looking at affordability. We do have players in the region who provide internet, but only if you can afford it, and only if you can afford, the different levels of internet access. And then there's a couple other issues. Just so you have the money, you can get internet, but do you have the devices, and do you have the devices that you need? So. Whether it be, most everybody has a cell phone now, or a smartphone, but it's really hard to access government documents online through a cell phone. It's hard for kids to do their homework. It's not necessarily the one device that you want. And then in addition to that, it's digital literacy. So you have your internet connection and you have your device. Now what do you do with it? And the government in some ways is helpful in that way. We do issue cell phones sometimes, but then people think, I don't know what to do with this. I've tried working with it, I don't get it, therefore I'm going to put it away and I never want to use it again. So I think we're looking at not just infrastructure, not just the stuff that we put in the ground to make it work, but what are the other levels that are barriers to everybody having equal access to the internet.
Michael, what do you think? We doing okay?
Well, let's see. I'm going to start kind of going back and then we'll go forward. Can I get a show of hands of people in this room who think that the Multnomah County Library is a valuable public asset? Every single hand that I saw. So some people call it the crown jewel of our community. So it's the oldest library west of the Mississippi. It traces its roots to 1864 when a small group of people came together and said that we want to increase access to books, which equals information. And then today, we can proudly say that access to the world's books and digital content is provided to all Multnomah County residents regardless of ability to pay. And that is so key, that access. So moving forward a little bit, when I was 12 years old, I used to ride my little BMX bike after school to the public library. And I was a latchkey kid, and that was the place that I felt at home, was the library. And I was a curious kid, so I was always checking out books on all these different topics. And one day, I kind of had befriended the librarians, and one day, the librarians pointed across the room, and she said, "Look at those two big boxes. I think you would be interested in those things." And what they were some of the first computers, first personal computers. And I started looking at it in this green screen, and people were typing on it, and I was transfixed. And pretty quickly, I ended up in a computer class. It was a summer class, and that changed the trajectory of my life forever. Changed my life forever. And the reason was access. You know, I grew up in a single parent home. We didn't have a lot, but having access to that computer, having access to that information, that library, changed my life. So here we are today, and I would say fundamentally to answer Maurice's question, I think we are not where we need to be, both in Multnomah County and in the United States. So we currently have 4 wireless cellular carriers that basically provide 98% of the wireless access in the United States. And we have 4 wired broadband carriers that provide the vast majority of residential and commercial access in the United States. And yet, to the Federal Communication Commission's own numbers, 21 million Americans lack broadband access, and even those numbers are very suspect. Recently, there was an extensive data project by Microsoft that indicates their data shows that 163 million Americans lack broadband access. And the FCC is there to provide or oversee and provide policy around access, and yet something is clearly not adding up. So in Multnomah County, bringing it back here, our own GIS maps show that the poorest and most underserved neighborhoods are the households that have the least access to broadband. And indeed, depending on the surveys, 25 to 30% of low-income, elderly, Black and Latinx households lack broadband access. Our system isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it's intended to do, what it's designed to do. And that is to maximize profits for huge out-of-state corporations and their shareholders at the expense of the rest of us. So the system isn't broken, it's working exactly as intended. But is that what we want as a community? And that's the core question for today, is what do we want? It's less about the technology, in my opinion, because there's lots of awesome technology. And as we say, fiber optics is core, that's central to everything and all the things that go on top of that. But it's really about what are our values and what are our priorities as a community. And I believe that the solution is municipal broadband, which is publicly owned internet infrastructure operated as a utility for all residents and businesses, similar to the public library. And hundreds of communities across the United States have already done this. This is not new. The first major one was Chattanooga, Tennessee in 1999. And it is entirely possible to do. It's technically very possible. But there are risks and there are challenges, and we need to look at that. More than 100 years ago, the United States was at a similar crossroads that we are today, but around electricity, where you had very high prices, monopoly corporations, and unequal access. Indeed, in rural America, they didn't even have electricity. And it wasn't until the Rural Electrification Act of 1936 that really spurred that, but that required government intervention to bring electricity to all households. And so what I'm really interested in exploring is what are our values as a community, and what do we want? And what do we want to put in place for future generations so that whoever it is, some decades from now will be up at this stage saying, we're so glad that we have this amazing fiber optic network that provides digital access for every resident and business, and it has spurred economic development and STEM education, and it has benefited our community for decades. So that's what I want to explore today.
Thank you both. So I want to make a little bit of a distinction between the word access and adoption. When I was reading through some of the congressional research reports on this topic, they really make that distinction, and they're measuring disparities in both. So both, do you have the ability to call Comcast and get internet to your home? And number 2, do you? And there are big disparities in both. Can you talk a little bit about the impacts of those disparities, the known impacts? Because I think, there's a tendency to say, like, so what, your kids can't watch kiddie videos. What are the impacts both today for people who don't have access, and how do those impacts compound in the future?
Sure. Well, there's so many ways that we can look through that lens. For me, again, it's kind of about priorities, and I will start with students. So the lack of access, internet access, it actually has a name. It's called the homework gap. And many people, and I myself, call it the cruelest aspect of the digital divide, because so much of our homework needs to be uploaded, the research needs to be done on the internet, and yet if you don't have internet access at home, how could you possibly be, how could that possibly be a level playing field? And so just starting there, any home, in my opinion, any home that lacks broadband access, it's unacceptable. Whatever we need to do, whatever technology we need to do, whatever we need to figure out economically, we have to close that gap, because you can't possibly, in today's world, internet access is fundamental to life. And so students, but there's so many, as I mentioned earlier, so many under-resourced, underserved community members, so many households that lack broadband access. And so looking for a job, accessing services, whether they're public or other services, there's just these layers of impact. And so it depends on which layer you look at, but it is absolutely, there's a fundamental impact on many, many levels.
Elizabeth?
So, excuse me. The access is definitely an issue, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the adoption part. A lot of people have access in one way or another. So maybe not to the home, but in schools, in libraries. Libraries are a great resource. The adoption is just a totally different story. Some people are forced to adopt, right? Like students have to. But then there's many other people who choose not to, so they don't think it's relevant to them. They think that they're too old to learn how to do it. They don't have time to learn how to use the internet. And so I think that's a critical other piece, and that goes more back into the education and digital literacy. But as we move forward, and I think about this a lot with government, specifically like Portland City government, is we are moving a lot of things to the web, which means that people can't come in and get a piece of paper and fill out, their application for a job in person. You have to do it online. Or if there's some, form you need to upgrade your building, that's all moving online, and the digital platform is great because it is more accessible. People don't have to come in, and I think in some ways for some people who are limited by accessibility, so like being able to actually get to City Hall or get to any of the buildings that we need to, the internet is crucial for that. But there are still some other issues where not everyone's going to adopt at the same time. So how do we help phase in some of these things, and how do we provide the education so that everyone believes that it is for them, and believes that they're capable of using the internet in all the ways that they need to.
So what is government's role in closing those gaps? Do we, as a bureaucrat myself, do we keep the triplicate forms rolling at the same time that we're building these fancy online platforms, or do we close the gap at the individual level through public policy that allows better access and adoption, or some combination of both?
I would say it's a combination of both. To Michael's point earlier, a lot of the issues that we're having are with regulation. So because internet is essential for our everyday lives, it should be looked at as a utility. And we need rules in place so that we don't have, 4 major carriers who dominate the market. We don't have, a bunch of the wireline companies saying, oh, I've got this region, you take that region, and we're all good to go. We need to do a lot of the work at the federal level, and I know people have certain thoughts about how fast that'll happen. But we do need to keep pushing, and the city of Portland has been very active in the work of challenging some of the rules at the FCC right now. That is one step, and it's something that, you know, as you think about what you can do, because this is a very active audience, like write to your congressman, write to the FCC, let them know that this is something that you want and you think is necessary for our country to be where we need to be. But there are definitely several levels. So if the FCC is not going to do the work, cede, you know, that power, let states, let cities do the work. And I think it's been really wonderful working with Michael because he is pushing for municipal broadband and seeing if that's a feasible option for the city of Portland. So, or actually the county completely. We are working with our partners. But it's definitely several levels of, you know, what the city can do on the national side, and then also what we want to do individually as a city as we help people adopt some of the technology moving forward.
Michael?
So in terms of what government can do, you know, whether that's local government, regional government, state, federal, it is, to me, it's one of those areas where government needs to step in, and especially in the current structure, locally, we need to step up and just decide where do we want to go as a community, because the free market, which I think is kind of a misnomer in this case, is clearly not providing for universal access. It's just not. It's just not. I mean, Comcast has its Internet Essentials for $10 a month for, you know, a crappy speed of 15 megabits. But there's so many barriers to that. You know, if you were late on a bill, or you can't get access to that. I mean, maybe it's not in the language or the culture. The materials are not in a culturally accessible way for you to adopt that. But that's just one example. There's so many barriers, and I'm a very pro-business. I mean, I think that I'm very pro-business. I think that a free market is great. But I think that from a physical infrastructure level, we have to just treat it like electricity or water and make it universal. It isn't a luxury anymore. It is a critical part of life. And I think we touched on public safety. And I think that's another lens that I hope we can have another question to talk about, because it really is critical digital infrastructure. Recently, there was an outage by CenturyLink across many states, and 911 services were down for almost 2 days. I mean, that's unacceptable. You know, we have to think of this digital infrastructure as critical infrastructure, just like electricity or water.
That's a perfect segue into the next question, but I need to remind our radio audience that this is the City Club of Portland. I'm Marisa Madrigal, and I'm with Michael Hanna, Data Engineer and Campaign Manager of Municipal Broadband PDX, and Elizabeth Perez, Interim Director for the City of Portland's Office for Community Technology. Thank you for listening. We are talking about the future of internet access, and my next question was going to be based on something that you said in your introductory answer, that 4 companies control 98% of, it sounds like both the cable, or the actual hardwired infrastructure, and also wireless technology. And in that kind of context, how resilient are we? We're in an area where there's natural hazards that can occur, or just outages, and potentially even cyber intrusions. What about our current? How resilient is our current infrastructure? What are our weaknesses?
Okay.
Michael.
So I just gave the example of CenturyLink and 911. Our current structure, as you mentioned, because it's so few corporations control that access, both on the wireless and the wired, that it's incredibly vulnerable in its current state. Last year, California had the largest wildfires in its history, and Verizon, which was providing the wireless access for the firefighters, throttled the access because they had reached the data cap. And they got a lot of flack for that, but it's like, it just highlights, like, in the biggest wildfires in California's history, you have this for-profit corporation that's throttling the axis. That's in no way is that acceptable. And we all know that climate disruption is coming. And I think, unfortunately, it's coming faster and more furiously than a lot of people predicted. We saw these massive floods in the Midwest this year. And we have to think of this as critical infrastructure. And when the Cascadia subduction zone earthquake hits, or other natural disaster, or climate disruption, or economic disruption, or terrorist attack, if anything happens in our community, we have to think about who owns that network. And we want redundant networks. We want not just a publicly owned fiber optic network, but redundant networks on multiple layers. And we have to own and control our community, because no one is going to come to our aid and care more about our community than us, every one of us. And so if we own and control it, we have much better chance of withstanding whatever comes our way, whether it's a zombie apocalypse or
Could happen.
A robot uprising. But seriously, resiliency to me is a core lens that we have to look through for all of this.
Elizabeth, what's the City of Portland's role in kind of addressing those gaps in resiliency or the vulnerabilities in the current state?
In the current state, we are having multiple conversations. We have a lot of resiliency that we need to work on, especially around our 911 services. And so that's the discussion that we're definitely having. I don't know if we've necessarily reached a conclusion there. That's not generally my area, but the question that I had, which I know I'm supposed to be answering questions, but in terms of, resiliency and redundancy, everything is connected through fiber in the ground. And so if there's a disruption, I have been thinking a lot about, like, how do we not only have the fiber, but then how else do you create that redundancy? And I'll be honest, I'm not totally sure. Do you, Michael, have an idea of how that works?
A little bit. I can.
Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but it's been something I've been trying to wrap my head around.
Yeah, it's a relatively new, concept to be thinking about this, but I think it's multiple layers. I think there's network design principles about resiliency. Designing for redundancy in power backups. I heard that recently Clackamas County, which has a fiber optic backbone that's owned by Clackamas County, now has a project to run a redundant connection out to Denver, because our current connection runs out to the Pittick building, which is a stone's throw from here. But in the event of emergencies, we have to have redundant paths. And so I think there's redundancy on multiple levels, but it also protection against hacking attempts and all sorts of other things. There's many levels.
So it sounds like there might be technological solutions to address some of the vulnerabilities, but in the context of we're the government thinking about resiliency, and the fiber and the infrastructure in many cases is not owned by us. It seems like that's quite the challenge to kind of wrangle that conversation.
Right, and we have a network that we use, the city and many of our jurisdictional partners. So that's something that we are working on and we're trying to expand. And just like any infrastructure, we're thinking a lot about how do we keep investing in it, because as we've seen in roads and highways, it's really nice when it's shiny and new. But how do you ensure that you continue to maintain it and make sure that as we go through the years, we don't forget about it and then one day think, oh, yeah, we should probably fix that. So there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of thinking around maintaining, because once you own the fiber, that means that you also have to take care of it. Yeah. And that is something that is expensive and, is not, I would say for, people in government, it's not generally what taxpayers are excited to pay money for, right? Is the upkeep of old things.
It's not as fun.
It's not as fun.
As new shiny things.
Exactly.
Well, we've talked a little bit in some of your conversation about the future, but I really want to turn our focus there now. So for each of you, what is your vision? If you could wave a magic wand and propel us forward into the future, what would our intranet infrastructure look like? What would our accessibility, what technology would be using, and how would we close the gaps?
My dream state is
Yes.
that we'd have fantastic fiber network to the home that was either free or low cost for everybody, and that we would start at the beginning in schools with teaching digital literacy and making sure that everybody is aware of what's available to them. And on top of that, knowing, I think we don't yet know what the future holds in terms of what devices we'll be using to access the internet. I've heard a lot of really cool talks lately about different gadgets we may be using. Not long ago we just had desktops, and now people have watches. So we just don't know what that holds, and I think it's really anticipating the needs of what people are going to want, and making sure that the infrastructure is there to meet those needs. And honestly, I think it is working with a lot of companies who are forward thinking, that know what they're going to be building, and know what their consumers are going to want. And it's really, it's important for us to keep our finger on the pulse of what private companies are doing, and having the desire to work with them and understand that their customers are also our residents, and so we're all trying to serve the same group of people.
Michael?
Sure. So definitely fiber to the premises. The United States is 26th out of the world's nations in fiber to the premises. We only have 11% of our residents and businesses that have fiber optics. Fiber optics is the backbone of the current internet, and it really is the foundational technology for any other technology that comes on top of that, whether that's wireless or otherwise. So fiber to the premises is just kind of a must-have. And from my perspective, from the municipal broadband perspective, that physical layer, the fiber and the network on both ends, is publicly owned. But beyond that, there's a lot of models for what digital services could be run over those networks. And here's where I am definitely a pro free market person, allowing for-profit companies to offer services, whether that's internet access, but telehealth is an emerging area, distance learning. Again, back on the climate disruption side, telework. We're gonna have to get out of our cars, and we're gonna have to provide, options for workers. And so, opening up that landscape for, kind of a brilliantly diverse ecosystem of for-profit companies providing digital services is something that I personally would love to see. And I would love to see, we touched on the education side, I'd love to see some sort of digital academy that's funded through our municipal network, where we have permanent stable funding for ongoing training of each new group, but of all ages, of all ages. And then finally, kind of zooming out a little bit beyond digital infrastructure, the community that I want to live in, given the uncertainties of the future, is a community that is locally self-reliant and resilient. So not just the digital infrastructure, but we have to transition to a post-carbon economy, and that means producing our own electricity, and our transportation has to become post-carbon, and also we have to think about, where does our food come from? The more locally self-reliant that we are as a community, the more we're going to be able to withstand whatever storms, real and metaphorical, are coming our way in our community.
Thank you. Before we get to the audience questions, I want to give you both the opportunity to address some of the criticism of some of the things that we've talked about today, both municipal broadband and 5G, which is the next generation cell phone tower network system. Network and system. Network system. So starting with 5G, I'm sort of fascinated by the whole debate because there seem to be some say, including doctors, but also Russian propaganda channels, that 5G poses a risk to our health. And, that's a concern to me, as a person. But I also want to set up our community to compete in the global market. And there is a global race to 5G. What are the facts? What are the known facts when it comes to 5G and the health impacts?
I'll go. So, the health effects are currently unknown. There are studies, but there are also health effects of 4G. There's the health effects of just having cell phones and everything that's, transmitted through the air. And it's not to say that there isn't real concern. City Council passed a resolution asking, the federal government to do more work on it. We are trying to work within the rules of government in working on 5G and knowing whether that's good for our city. We don't know yet. I will say that it is a balance. So, we've had people say, well, why don't you just stop it until we know more? Well, we're bound by law. And it's trying to understand also, like, if we decided that that's what we wanted to do, is that what our taxpayers want to pay for? Do they want to pay for us to enter into lawsuits? I don't know. Yeah. So we are currently working with the cell phone carriers on coming up with the correct fees for our right-of-way, and that gets a little bit wonky, so I won't get into it, but they all have to have franchises. And so we're working within the rules that we currently have. In terms of, whether we anticipate that it will be something that we definitely need in the future, I've also had people say, well, then, make sure that, the city doesn't use 5G. Well, it's just like the transition from 1G to 2G to 3G. You didn't make that decision. The cell phone carriers made it for you. And so we could, and they phase out those phones too, and they phase out technology. So, I would say that consumers generally have to make that decision for themselves, one, and if enough people said, no, that's not what we want, that'd be a clear statement. However, I don't know if many people are as that informed, and I don't know that many people are that concerned. There are definitely people who are, but like we said with just digital adoption in general, there's a lot of people who, are working every day. They don't think about those things, and they know that they need a cell phone to do the things that they need to do, and they know they need service. So the city of Portland's really tried to balance a lot of that out and, work with the carriers, try to push the federal government on things, and hopefully at some point, we'll get some leadership at the national level, or we'll be able to have the ability to do it ourselves.
Thank you. Michael, I don't know if you have any thoughts on 5G, but if you do, please share.
I have a lot of thoughts about 5G. I'll just summarize just a few of my concerns about 5G, and which are personal, but also a lot of people share. Starting with the federal level, the fact that there's a preemption that prevents local governments and local residents from making their own decisions about 5G, that alone is a red flag. That is concerning because it takes away our local sovereignty, our local autonomy. So secondarily, where 5G is really different from 3G and 4G prior wireless technologies is that hundreds or perhaps thousands of microcells are going to be installed in residential areas right outside people's homes. And that raises a lot of concerns, not only property value concerns, which is being raised a lot in California, but it's one of those things where whether you subscribe to the service or not, it's transmitting 24/7 outside your home. And especially for pregnant women or young children where there's a lot of research that's concerning, increase in radio frequency, shows an increase in miscarriages. It just would cause me to pause. Personally, actually, my biggest personal concern is around the surveillance, because the whole smart home, smart city thing is really pushed by corporations to extract and mine our data, and we are the product. We are the product. And so, we've heard all these stories of Alexa, people, listening in or, listening to the recordings and transcribing them. And we've rushed into this whole technology area where not all new technology is good technology. And who owns it? And what is it for? And what's being done with the data? I mean, I think we need to start really asking these questions in ways that we haven't been as a society.
So that actually brings up a question, excuse me, a question for me around municipal broadband, because I think one of the criticisms about municipal broadband is privacy and surveillance. And if the government is going to own a network, what does that mean for my data? I'm already uncomfortable with corporations having it, but now the government's going to see my web browsing history. So what is your response to that criticism?
Yeah, I think that's probably the number one issue that people raise, when I've spoken to people, hundreds or thousands of people about municipal broadband, is that concern. There's a lot of lack of trust broadly in our society right now, lack of trust of institutions, government agencies, corporations. There's lack of trust across the board for good reason, because our trust has been violated. How many Facebook breaches, how many breaches of the wireless carriers, releasing our geolocation data. There's a lack of trust for good reason. And so I get it, I understand. And my response to that about people not trusting government with our broadband is if it's explicitly not for profit, that removes the incentive to mine our data and sell it to the highest bidder. So that's one. Number two, if we own the network, we define the rules and the policies. And so if there's transparency and accountability in that network, we can define those rules and say, we will never throttle your content, with permanent net neutrality, for example, or we will never track and sell your browsing history. We can write that into the rules of our network because it's our network. And so that's kind of my response is that, if we build it in where it's transparent and accountable, then we can hold our local government because it's us accountable on that.
Elizabeth?
Sure. So the issue I think that we are seeing is not necessarily that, which carrier or how you're getting your internet, but it's really the companies that or the websites that you're going to. It's, whenever you search on Google, they've got that information. Whenever you're on Facebook, they've got that information. It's an interesting critique of municipal broadband that the government would have your information when it's really easy to get your information. You're making that choice whenever you go to a website. I make that choice every day. So I think that's the most interesting critique I've heard. So I think that's not necessarily a critique of municipal broadband, but a critique of just the way that data is really the currency now. I mean, that's what people are using. And I'll say just, a plug for the city of Portland. We just recently passed our privacy and information rules for the city. And it's really exciting because it gives the city an opportunity to look at the data that we take from people, because people give us their data all the time and we ask for it, and from start to finish, really decide what we need and what we need the data for, and only take as much as we actually need, and then make sure that we are being good data stewards throughout the life of the data or the information, and then at the end making sure that we destroy it when we don't need it anymore. So in terms of the government being like, people being afraid of the government having that information, the city of Portland is taking a really big step right now and saying that like, that's not what we want to do. We want to make sure that we only use it for the things that we need it, and to be transparent. So when we take it, we say this is what we are taking, or this is what we're asking for, and this is what we're going to use it for, so that people are aware of the information that they're giving us and what we're going to do with it. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you both. This is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Marisa Madrigal, and I'm with Michael Hanna, Data Engineer and Campaign Manager for Municipal Broadband PDX, and Elizabeth Perez, Interim Director of the City of Portland's Office for Community Technology. We are now at the portion of our program where we take questions from the audience. You must be a City Club member to ask a question at the mic, but anyone can submit a question on an index card or by messaging City Club on social media. At the mic, you will have 30 seconds to ask your question, and if your question starts to look like a statement, I will lovingly give you a punishing look and ask you to state your question. Mary Margaret Wheeler-Weber.
Well, thank you for saving some time there, saving my name for me. Mary Margaret Wheeler-Weber, City Club member. My question is, since so many areas around the country have already done this kind of work, what have you learned about the riskiest aspects of this work, and what are we doing, what can we be doing to mitigate that? And I'm interested in that from both of our panelists today. Thank you.
I'm unclear on the question.
Was it specifically about municipal broadband?
I think yes, I would start with municipal broadband, but I'm interested in Elizabeth's perspective on the risks moving forward as well. Yeah.
Do you want to start with
Okay,
me?
sure,
Yeah.
Charles, sir. So, like any large project, there are risks, and one of the goals is always in large projects to mitigate the risks as much as possible. So, for Multnomah County and the 5 cities within Multnomah County, Portland, Gresham, Wood Village, Fairview, and Troutdale, we've launched a feasibility study, pooled our funds and launched a feasibility study, which we will get the results back early next year. And that entire study is about mitigating risks. And so we need to look at, what are the economics of this? What are the technical obstacles, challenges, and opportunities? And so, yeah, we want to go into all of this with eyes wide open, understanding the landscape as clearly as possible. And so, yeah, economic is probably one of the number one risks, but there are also technical risks. And we've seen in other communities challenges with building out fiber optics without adequate planning ahead of time. And so I think the more upfront planning to understand the landscape, which we are actively doing, the better chance we have of mitigating those risks.
Yeah, so I think the feasibility study is a great first step around municipal broadband. And the thing that I've been working on in the city of Portland is really understanding what are our needs. So municipal broadband is a possible solution, but we have several needs and several priorities that we're really trying to tackle. And so, is municipal broadband the right way to go? If possible. But that's also, a midterm, long-term solution. So what are we also doing now? And so everything is based in time. What are the risks now to individuals, to families of not starting the work now? And then what are the risks long-term? And I think there are infrastructure questions, there are societal questions. But I think, Michael, I think, has done a really good job in the leadership of really pushing for a feasibility study, and we're getting deep into it right now, so we're excited.
Thank you. Next question.
Nick Orvanek, a City Club member. You brought up the incident of Verizon. And if I were to call a company like that a weak link in the internet chain, is the infrastructure around the country such that we could realize the potential of what you're proposing we bring up in Portland and the other cities?
So I think, in traditional network design in computers, you look at what are the single points of failure and trying to build in redundancies as many locations as possible. And so I kind of touched on it, but I think the current state, with CenturyLink and the 911 and Verizon in the contract and the firefighters, those are single points of failure, which obviously from a public safety perspective, that's not viable in any way. But even though I'm very much in support of fiber optic to the premises, I think again it's foundational for anything we're going to do in the future. We do need to look at it at multiple levels, because I think there is absolutely a role for wireless communication. We have FirstNet, which is a national federal public safety network. There's satellite, technologies are available, and more is coming. We have HamNet, which is ham radio network operators. So I think these multiple layers of networks are great, because again, it'll give us redundancy and multiple paths in no matter what kind of incident might come our way.
That was great.
I just want to say I'm just reading through these index card questions, and these are incredible. This group of, this audience is right on point, but we'll take one more from the mic.
Okay, my name is Russell Senior. I'm a City Club member, a new member. Given that the FCC is a poster child for regulatory capture, and that the owners of the infrastructure have been granted exclusive control of policy and pricing on that infrastructure, what mechanism, short of public ownership, will give any prospect of providing for users' interests? Thanks.
There are compromises a city has to make, right? And so, yes, municipal broadband may be the way to go. It's expensive, and to start. Oh, sure, definitely. And it's a risk. And I would say that, we are looking at several different options. So, yes, there are limited companies who are doing the work in Portland. Short term, does that mean that we work with them and try to get prices lowered? Does it mean that the city of Portland finds some way of paying for people's internet? I'm throwing out ideas. We don't know, right? And so I think we have to keep exploring, and short of federal rules changing, we have to keep options open, and sometimes that means maybe we do some negotiating. Maybe we ask if Comcast is willing to expand their Internet Essentials. It's not the greatest option, but it's an option, and so we can't afford to wait several years, because there's kids in schools now that don't have access. And there's people right now who don't have access to, healthcare. So while I love the long-term solution, and I think we need to keep working towards that, there's a lot that we can be doing right now. And I think there's several people in this room and listening that are part of our digital inclusion network. There is a lot happening, and it's not going to be the fix, but there's a lot that we are currently doing that we're trying to get to the point where everybody has access and everybody is adopting.
I'm going to read a question from an index card, and there's a little intro. Aside from well-financed opposition from monopolistic ISPs who are protective of their profits, what are Portland's barriers to deployment of municipal broadband, and what can the average citizen do to remove those barriers? And then there's sort of a follow-up. The consensus seems to be that we'll have to build and deploy any muni broadband system ourselves, but that it will be dependent on equipment and software built overseas. How can we mitigate those risks as well? So barriers and risks, you can boil it down to those.
The first is, again, we're doing our feasibility study. I am not an expert in deploying municipal broadband. I'm really excited to find out what we find in the feasibility study, and until those results come back, I'm not sure.
Michael?
So there's a question, part of the question about reliance on overseas equipment and technology. Well, fiber optics, Corning makes fiber optics, which is a United States company, and so that's not an issue. And on the equipment side, I think there's lots of U.S.-made, equipment, options. And we also as a nation probably should support more of those. I would love to see more of our technology equipment manufactured in the United States. But it's, again, I think the feasibility study is going to answer those specific questions here in Multnomah, and that's exactly why we're doing it. So it's kind of hard to say until we get those back, to really specifically answer that right now.
So one of the questions that people are wondering about is how long would it take to build a municipal network, and what would it cost? How would we pay for it? Taxes, fees?
So again, I think the feasibility study is going to answer those questions. How it's funded is core. I mean, let me step back for a second. The subscribers who would subscribe to a future municipal broadband network, ultimately those subscribers' fees will pay for the network, both the original capital expense and the ongoing and future operating expenses. However, like any major project, like building a building or anything, you need capital up front to build out the infrastructure before you get your first subscribers. So that's part of the challenge, is that how do we fund it initially? And it could be done in phases. It could be done, there's even private funding options for initial phases. But once revenue starts rolling in from subscribers, then other options open up for funding. So it really depends on how it's been done. And of the hundreds of communities that have done it, they've almost all done it in different ways. Almost certainly it'll be a combination of funding sources. But part of the reason that I like it long term, and I hear what Elizabeth is saying, we have a structure that we have to work within, now, and it's a corporate structure and it's FCC structure, federal, state, local. There's all these constraints within our current structure. But long term, municipal broadband has the ability to fully pay for itself, fully pay for the ongoing operating costs, and then create, just expand for the future. So it's the hard part is getting started, like any major project.
Thank you both, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Perez and Michael Hanna.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up for today, and we have to pause the conversation on this important and really interesting and fascinating topic. We are so grateful for everyone who made today's forum possible. Thank you to Michael and to Elizabeth for helping us see the digital opportunities that lie ahead for our future. Marisa, thank you so much for moderating. Leslie, thank you for all of your work in producing today's event. Thank you all for being here with us. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next time.